Hi, everyone. My name's Omar Kashat. I'm one of the adult services librarians here at the Carroll Stream Public Library, and I'm just here because we're hopefully all here to learn a bit about the Marvel Cinematic Universe because we're having a big celebration because the MCU, or Marvel Cinematic Universe, MCU for short, is celebrating its 15th anniversary this year. It's first started, as we can see down there, started on May 2nd, 2008 with the release of Iron Man, and it goes all the way until today and beyond. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop my video real quick, and I'll just launch you through our presentation, and maybe you'll learn some things you didn't know, or maybe you'll know all of this already, and it's just a good refresher. So anyway, yes, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a celebration, May 2nd, 2008 to today. All right, so moving on to the next slide. So second here. So this is a slide of which I'm not going to show the video clips for, but basically I am Iron Man. The first clip there is of the Marvel Studios logo. Marvel Studios is the one making all these Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. And then also the second one was just the trailer for Iron Man. But, if you got these slides later on, you can click those links and you'll be able to watch both of those clips. Now, of course, before we get started, the question is, well, what is the MCU? Well, the MCU stands for, as I said, Marvel Cinematic Universe. The MCU is a series of interconnected films and shows from Marvel Studios. It was originally intended to be distributed or released from multiple film companies. Marvel Studios was the one making the movies, but other companies like Paramount or Universal would be releasing them. We'll get to a little bit more on that later. It started in 2008 to the present, so as I said, celebrating their 15th anniversary. Currently, as of this recording into 2023 in June, there are currently 32 films have been released and 11 more are currently in production. Per Wikipedia, as of again, June 2023, the budget total for these 32 films is somewhere between $6.2 and $6.7 billion. However, the box office total of these 32 films is almost $30 billion. So that's a lot of money that they're raking in. Just goes to show how popular of a concept and a movie series that this is. Now, what the MCU is not, though, is, of course, it does not include characters like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and other DC comic heroes. Of course, DC Comics is a totally separate company from Marvel and is instead part of what's called the DCEU, or the DC Extended Universe from Warner Brothers, which is owned by Warner Brothers. DC Comics is. It also does, in fact, not include every Marvel property. One of the big exceptions is Spider-Man and his related villains. This also, up until like 3 or 4 years ago, also included the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, because the movie rights for those characters were owned by 20th Century Fox, and then Disney, who owns Marvel, subsequently bought Fox. But again, we'll get to more of that later. But there's also some other characters like the Hulk and Namor and others who actually, even though Marvel can make movies about them, other companies have the right to distribute them, which is why, like Universal, which is Pictures, which is why we haven't seen a Hulk movie in 15 years. We haven't seen a Namor movie in forever, and likely never will. Anyway, more on this again a little bit later. If you're watching a movie, like, for example, like you saw this in Morbius, we'll probably see it also in Kraven the Hunter, which is coming out. If you see something that says in association with Marvel Studios, that means it's not an MCU production. It just means that Marvel Studios is superficially involved, but ultimately these movies are not part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, of course, the trivia time, though, is, if you know your Marvel trivia, what was the first full-length Marvel movie to appear in theaters? And I don't necessarily mean in the MCU. Was it Iron Man? Was it Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Was it Namor the Submariner, D the Punisher, or E Howard the Duck? I'll just pause for a moment here while you think of what your answer might be. And okay, time's up. And the answer is Howard the Duck. I first gave this presentation yesterday, and one person in the audience did know this. Howard the Duck was the very first Marvel movie ever made, because Howard the Duck is a Marvel character. He originally showed up in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. But in 1986, George Lucas and Lucasfilm produced a Howard the Duck movie with Universal Pictures, and it was not the best. I like bad movies, and I think there is still something enjoyable out of this, but it's also been a long time since I saw this. To give you an idea of how long, I last saw this movie on VHS, aside from clips here and there on YouTube recently. But regardless, I saw this movie on VHS. In addition to Howard the Duck, over the years since then, some other odds and ends were, of course, Dolph Lundgren was in a Punisher movie. which I did see again on VHS. This was a rather interesting movie. It came out in 1989. I believe this might have seen a theatrical release, but it's interesting seeing Dolph Lundgren as the Punisher. In fact, I heard that there were legal reasons that they couldn't use a trademark skull logo in this movie. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's why you don't see the skull logo anywhere associated with this movie. There was also a Captain America movie that came out in the early 90s that was originally intended to go to movie theaters, but instead ended up just being released on home video. I also saw this on VHS, although this was also a very long time ago, and I remember very little about this movie. David Hasselhoff was in a Nick Fury movie, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., if you can believe that. This was originally intended to be a pilot for a TV show, which never took off. I like David Hasselhoff. There's this whole pilot, a 90-minute TV movie, if you will, is entirely available on YouTube. I caught some clips of it. I mean, it's a David Hasselhoff show. I don't dislike David Hasselhoff. I enjoy Knight Rider. I've seen some Baywatch that I think he's done a good job in. It's just very interesting that he was cast as Nick Fury. And it also says the last superhero is a little tagline there. I wonder if that's because they couldn't use any other Marvel characters, would be my guess, besides Nick Fury. And of course, we also had Generation X, which was another TV movie that was intended to be a pilot. Basically, Fox wanted to make its own live action X-Men TV show. And so they made Generation X, which featured Jubilee and Emma Frost and Banshee and the other characters we see there. I'm a big X-Men fan, so I will not admit to owning this on bootleg DVD, but regardless, you can watch the whole entirety of this TV movie on YouTube as well. It's all right. I mean, I'm a big X-Men fan, and you'll hear that repeatedly throughout this presentation, so I can live with it, but needless to say, it did not launch the TV series they were hoping for. And now, of course, there was also the movie that never was, and if you didn't know, Roger Corman in the 90s produced a Fantastic Four movie. They filmed the whole movie, they finished production, it was all set to release in theaters, and Roger Corman and whoever he was working with said, nope, we're not releasing it. What the people who were making the movie outside of Roger Corman and maybe a couple other people didn't realize is that this movie was basically a sham. What the idea is that the movie rights for the Fantastic Four had been sold to somebody. I don't think it was Roger Corman, but they went to Roger Corman and they said, you know what, we have to hold on to the movie rights. I don't want to lose them, so we have to make a movie. If we don't make a movie, we can't hold on to the rights. So Roger Corman's like, fine, we'll just make this movie. I heard they filmed it in a month. And when they were set to come out, they said we're not going to release it, so they could so whoever it was could hold on to the movie rights. So they made a documentary about this, Doomed: The Untold Story of Roger Corman's The Fantastic Four. How many movies did Roger Corman make that never got released? One, at least that's what the tagline says. And there you go. Again, you can watch this on YouTube if you have the opportunity to. The trailer is what's linked to in that link down there below. I have yet to watch this, aside from some clips, but I really should watch this. Because from the sounds of things, everybody in it really wanted to make a good Fantastic Four movie, and it never got released. Now, there was one movie though that was a success in the 90s, and that was Blade with Wesley Snipes. I sometimes forget that this is a Marvel character. I remember Blade a little bit from the Spider-Man the Animated TV show in the 90s, but I never really associated Blade with Marvel, and even to this day, I sometimes forget that he's associated with Marvel. But regardless, the movie was the success, and people online like to point out that, the Marvel movies, their first success as a property was with Blade. But here's the thing, though, the road to the MCU, it almost wasn't. We're talking about the years 1989 to 2000. So in 1989, Batman the movie was released. Why were we talking about Batman? Well, there was Batmania. Batmania sweeps the nation, and that basically means everyone was crazy about Batman. They had all this, shirts, TV shows, shirts, hats, merchandise. Everyone loved comic books. All of a sudden, not really all of a sudden, but there was a big interest in comic books, and around the same time there were articles talking about how there were these really rare comic books like Action Comics #1, or and Batman issue 1 and Detective Comics issue 1. Anyway, they're talking like these are worth a lot of money. So people thought, oh great, well comics are a worthwhile investment. So basically, all these companies were doing, they were putting out these #1 issues, and people were buying them in droves and thinking that, hey, you know what, this is worth something. Well, it wasn't. People slowly came to realize that, that if everyone's buying these #1 issues, then there's really not any money in them at all. So basically the bubble starts to burst in 1993, the comic book bubble, and then it really bursts by 1996 and comic book sales nosedive. Now, what that gives us, though, during this time period when there was the bubble, was the best-selling comic book of all time, and that was X-Men issue 1. X-Men issue 1 came out in 1991. No, the X-Men are not a characters that first started out in the 90s. They started out in the 1960s, but they relaunched the comic book. I have this issue. I really enjoy this issue. It is very much a relaunch of the X-Men line, and it introduced them in outfits that we probably primarily may remember them as. But it was released October 1991. It was written by Chris Claremont, who had written X-Men for, gosh, almost 20 years at that point. Or perhaps not that long, but he'd been writing it throughout the 1980s. Artwork was done by Jim Lee. Jim Lee is a well-known artist. He's currently the guy who's running DC Comics at the moment. In fact, I think just all of DC Comics is more or less run by him. And then it had 4 interlinking variant covers. I mean, it had 4 covers that, when fit together, showed all the X-Men characters, and it had 1 additional gatefold cover that also showed all the X-Men covers. We basically had 5 covers, but it sold 8.1 million copies. As part of this, I sort of hid. I wasn't going to present on the slide originally, but what happened was a couple of years later, Jim Lee and a bunch of other major Marvel artists went to Marvel and said, we're selling these comic books, whether they're Spider-Man or X-Men or you name it, and they're making all these millions. They're selling them for all the, you're making like $8 million off of our work. Plus, they're like, well, we want to have our own, create our own series. We want more rights. We want more privileges. And we want more money. And Marvel said no. And then basically, I believe it was 7 guys left Marvel to go form Image Comics. So there was a mass exodus of talent only a couple of years later, right as the bubble was starting to burst. Now, between the talent exodus, potentially, might have led to this, but also because of Marvel's business decisions, throughout the 1990s, Marvel Comics was on the verge of Chapter 11. And basically the bubble didn't help either, because once the bubble burst, then whatever money they were making went down the drain as well. They finally filed for bankruptcy in 1996, and they were saved by Isaac, or Ike as he's known, Perlmutter. And at one point, though, Michael Jackson, yes, that Michael Jackson, he made a serious offer to try and acquire Marvel Comics, but he was just bluntly turned down. Now, as part of their attempts to remain solvent, try and say, avoid bankruptcy, and this is leading to the MCU, if you're not sure where any of this is going, Marvel sold off whatever movie rights they could that studios would be interested in. They sold off, the X-Men rights, they sold off the Spider-Man rights, they sold off the Hulk rights, Fantastic Four, they sold a whole bunch of others as well. We saw in that previous slide, the Punisher was sold off. I don't know that Howard the Duck was, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was in the 80s. Black Widow also was sold off. I think I heard the Black Panther was sold off. Ghost Rider was sold off. All of these characters, they've just sold off these rights, often for some very lucrative deals on the part of these movie studios, which some of these rights were in perpetuity as long as they kept making movies. In fact, as another example of that, Marvel theme park rights were largely given to Universal Studios in perpetuity. That means basically forever. That's east of the Mississippi River, that is. So what that means is in Universal Studios Florida, they have islands of adventure. There are a bunch of Marvel superheroes there, even though right now Marvel is now owned by Disney. Well, Disney cannot really have very many, if any, of their major Marvel superheroes in Disney World. They can have them in Disneyland, but they can't have them in Disney World. And there's really not much they can do about that, because again, Marvel really needed the money. So they had these crazy deals where they sold off the rights to the theme park to Universal Studios forever, unless Universal Studios says that we're not going to keep using these characters. But of course they're going to keep using these characters because they're making money off of it. And basically that's basically the way things shake out. Now, the Guardians of the Galaxy, you probably think, well, what about the Guardians of the Galaxy ride in Disney World? Well, the Guardians of the Galaxy, their current lineup, they really didn't materialize until 2008. So, this is stuff that was up until the point that the rights got sold. Any characters after that are free game or fair game. And then there's a link down there that talks a little bit more about Marvel Comics history and their bankruptcy. But then, of course, there was one bright spot to this, and that was the MCU, or that we did have an MCU in the 90s. That was the Marvel Cartoon Universe. I can't link to any of these clips, but the first one is the X-Men animated series in the 1990s. I was a kid growing up watching this show. I really, really enjoyed the X-Men series. I think that's what led to my love of the X-Men. That, when I got X-Men issue 1. After that, of course, we had Spider-Man, the animated series, which came out shortly thereafter in the 1990s. In fact, there's a Marvel cartoon universe because there was a two-part episode where Spider-Man had encountered the X-Men from the X-Men, the animated series, and all the voice actors who were voicing all the characters showed up. And then at the very end of the Spider-Man show, they had what's called Secret Wars, which was basically Spider-Man had to fight a bunch of villains like Doctor Doom and Red Skull and his villains. And he basically got the Fantastic Four, who had their own comic book or their own cartoon show at the time. He got Captain America, who I don't recall whether or not it had a cartoon show, but had appeared in the Spider-Man, the animated series. And he also got Storm from the X-Men to show up. And again, just a whole bunch of superheroes in a cartoon universe to come together to fight Secret Wars. So there was a 90s Marvel cartoon universe. The Hulk also had his own show, but it wasn't on Fox like Spider-Man and X-Men was. It was on UPN. So the Hulk never really featured in either the X-Men or the Spider-Man animated shows at the time. But they also had an Iron Man cartoon show, which I thought was okay, but I just didn't enjoy it as much as I did X-Men and Spider-Man. Now, moving on from 2000, we have the M without the CU. And these are what I like to call the popularity years, going from 2000 to 2008. There was a turning tide of Marvel film popularity. Because X-Men the animated series and Spider-Man the animated series had done so well, at least for X-Men, at least, Fox saw how good, 20th Century Fox saw how good Spider-Man or X-Men the animated series was doing on TV. So they're like, fine, we want the X-Men movie rights. So they got it, and then they released X-Men in the year 2000, which is very popular. The Spider-Man movie rights have been floating around for a while, but basically Sony finally got a hold of them in the late 2000s and said, we're going to make our own Spider-Man movie. And they did, and it was very successful. Meanwhile, the Blade series is still continuing along. We had Blade 2 in 2002. And then, of course, we had the Hulk movie, which I want to say was 2003, 2004. I think it was 2004. And then, of course, you had the Fantastic Four movies. There were two of them. This is the poster for Rise of the Silver Surfer. And there is, of course, Captain America as Johnny Storm. Of course, the obvious joke to make because there's Chris Evans. But anyway, so yeah, and the Hulk Eric Bana was playing the Hulk in that movie. Of course, we had other movies as well. We had Ghost Rider with Nicolas Cage and Eva Mendes. If you're a big comic book fan or a big Nicolas Cage fan, you know that that Nicolas Cage's name he was born with is Nicholas Coppola. He's related to Francis Ford Coppola, Sofia Coppola. He's related to the whole Coppola family. Well, he didn't want to have his career just be like, oh, well, people are only going to hire me because of my name. I want to be an actor on my own terms. So he was a big fan of comic books, and especially Marvel comic books, and especially of Luke Cage, who was Power Man. So Nicolas Cage is like, you know what? I'm going to name my last name for when I'm acting is going to be Nicolas Cage. So, and he did it. And at one point, I think he owned like $1 million plus worth of comics. I think he sold them off just because, because he didn't really need them anymore, but he's a huge comic book fan. We had The Punisher with Thomas Jane that came out. I did see that movie eventually on VHS or DVD. I never saw this in theaters. It was okay. It didn't get the best reviews. Daredevil, which I did see in theaters, but completely forgot about when I was originally doing this presentation. Of course, Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner. And then there's the Penguin and there on the left. That's of course a joke. But anyway, of course, and then we had, Michael Clark Duncan, who of course sadly passed away. I thought he did a good Kingpin. But anyway, but again, these are MC, and of course on the television side, for those of you who remember these shows, Mutant X was an attempt by Marvel Studios because they didn't have the X-Men rights anymore. They gave them to Fox for making movies. They said, well, we're going to do our best to make an X-Men TV show without any of the X-Men. So they made this show called Mutant X, which is not even related to barely even related to Marvel. But regardless, they made this TV show. It was on for 3 years. Fox sued them. That was the whole thing. Again, I'm a fan of this show. I own it on DVD. I'm probably one of the few fans of this show, but if you're reading this and you're a fan of Mutant X, then we're both fans together. And then, of course, then that ran from 2001, I think, to 2003, 2004. In 2004, there was actually a Blade TV show, which aired for 1 season on Spike TV. And I'm probably also one of the few people who saw that on TV. It was okay. I mean, Blade wasn't even really the main character, but they tried. And anyway, those are just 2 shows you may not even be aware of. But now moving on, though, we're dealing with the MCU finally begins circa 2008. So what's happening is, as all these movies were coming out and all these TV shows were coming out, the problem is because Marvel had sold off the movie rights, they weren't making any of the money off of these movies. These movies were making like millions at the box office. Marvel was getting nothing. Again, Marvel was still not really financially secure. I mean, they were plugging along, but I mean, they came out of bankruptcy, so they weren't getting any money. And they thought, well, the only way we're going to make money is if we make our own movies. And then the next question was, well, what characters do we even still have? Are there any ones we weren't able to sell off that nobody wanted? Were there any that that the rights were returned to us because the movie studios originally bought them, thought there wasn't any money in them? Well, that enters then the man with the plan. This is Kevin Feige. Kevin Feige at the time in the early 2000s was an up-and-coming producer. He worked on X-Men, Spider-Man, and most of the other 2000s Marvel movies. He was a big comic book fan as well, and I guess I assume the story is true, but during the X-Men movie, in the first X-Men movie that came out in 2000, he was basically, they're like, as they're making the movie, the people making the movie are like, to the cast, are like, oh, don't read the comic books. No, you don't need to read the comic books. But Kevin Feige in his office had a bunch of X-Men comic books, and he would invite the cast in to show them the comic books and better explain their characters. So he knew his Marvel history. Avi Arad, who was running Marvel Studios, and hired him to be second in command as Marvel was starting to make their own, Marvel Studios were now going to start making their own movies. Well, because Kevin Feige had a lot of knowledge of Marvel Comics, well, what he realized is that if the properties that Marvel was either unable to option off to other studios or the rights had been returned over the years, they had the rights to the characters who formed the Avengers. So what they could do is they could then make, individual movies of these characters and then have them all come together for the Avengers movie. Well, cut forward 15 years later, he's still running the show. Feige is now the president of Marvel Studios, and he was the chief creative officer of Marvel Entertainment, which comprised of all the different Marvel divisions. Although Marvel Entertainment was dissolved earlier this year. There are various reasons why that might have been the case. But anyway, Marvel Entertainment went away, so he's still running Marvel Studios. I'm uncertain if he's still the chief creative officer of actually Marvel Comics, which is still around. All the Marvel divisions are still around. They just got moved into different parts of the Disney company. But anyway, so yeah, he's still running the show all these years later, and he's one of, if not the most successful movie producer of all time because of how much money these movies have made. Now, the thing with Marvel, though, is Marvel Studios in the early days was, they could make the movies, but they didn't really have the ability to release them. So they said they could make the movies, but to actually get them into theaters, they needed help. And so the plan was to partner with existing distributors to push out standalone movies like Iron Man, Captain America, all the ones we're going to hear about in just a moment, to then build up to a combined Avengers movie. Now, the MCU was not actually the first cinematic universe. There have been ones prior than that. The Universal Studios monsters like Frankenstein, the Wolfman, all those characters, they had crossed over occasionally. I know Frankenstein met the Wolfman, and then a bunch of them were in Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein. The Invisible Man was in it briefly, but there was. Of course, there was Frankenstein, there was the Wolfman, there was Dracula, these characters had all sort of been moving around together in the 50s, about a decade, or the 40s and the 50s. About a decade later, the Godzilla series also was sort of its own cinematic universe because Godzilla later started fighting other monsters who had been in their own original movies. That was a big, and so, yeah, so the Godzilla series is also comprised of its own cinematic universe. Kevin Feige is also a big Star Trek fan. Throughout the 90s, more so on TV than in the movies, there were multiple Star Trek series going on in the 90s, and those characters also crossing over into other shows and stuff like that. So the cinematic universe was not unheard of. Although to make one to the degree that Marvel did, they were sort of blazing a new trail for something that really hadn't been done on the big screen before. Now, because Marvel didn't have the ability to release those movies, that allowed them to then work with existing contracts that Marvel had made with these studios to make characters that they either didn't have the rights to, or else there was distribution rights issues. Like, for example, the Hulk. So Marvel Studios, they did get the rights to the Hulk returned to them, but Universal Studios, by returning the rights, basically said, well, you can make the movies, but we have the right of first refusal. And what that means is that Universal Studios, when Marvel makes a Hulk movie, they have to go to Universal Studios and say, do you want to release this movie? And Universal Studios is pretty obviously going to say yes, because there's money to be made in it. But basically that's what it is. And in fact, In fact, they also, you may not know this, is Marvel had studios had pretty grand aspirations or pretty grand dreams in the early days, because if you remember, they also worked with Paramount Pictures as well. That was their main distributor. But or initially, but if you ever see, like, this is what the second clip is. So if you remember the end of Iron Man, uh, uh, when Tony Stark meets Nick Fury in his office, Nick Fury originally says, as if assorted superheroes, weren't enough, I have to deal with you. In the original filmed ending, which is that second clip there, he actually was a little bit more specific. He actually said, as if gamma accidents, radioactive bug bites, and assorted mutants weren't enough, I have to deal with you. Marvel in those days, that's a good glimpse into what they were hoping to accomplish. It sounds like they wanted to work with Sony to have Spider-Man in the MCU much earlier than he was. They wanted to work with Fox to get the X-Men into the MCU. They really wanted to work with these studios, but I think they dialed it back because they weren't sure if that would pan out or not. But that was really the big thing, is they could work with these other companies to then make these movies all joined together, even though Marvel Studios, again, didn't have the rights to them. Again, they wanted to work with these other studios in order to pull it off. Now, again, as I said before, their major partner in the early years was Paramount Pictures. They released just about everything was called Phase 1 of the MCU, which we're about to get to. And that final clip is a bit of a silly one. When they were making X-Men the movie in 2000, they had a joke where they had a blooper reel where basically the X-Men run into this room, and then suddenly Spider-Man runs in behind them, and then Spider-Man is like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong movie. I am so sorry. And then he runs away, and then James Marsden as Cyclops runs after him. It's a pretty funny clip. Again, I just can't show it to you, but it's that third link there. But yeah, but Spider-Man, of course, was a Sony, X-Men is Fox, so on and so forth. Again, Marvel had some pretty big dreams in those early days. So that brings us to Phase 1, which Marvel breaks up its movies into phases. We're talking about the Avengers Initiative from 2008 to 2012. Of course, we had Iron Man, which came out on May 2nd, 2008. You probably want to start watching right now. I will fully admit I've not seen this movie. I knew it was coming out when then. I knew about the MCU in 2008. But I never went to go see this movie, and I still have yet to see this movie, but I probably should put that on my list of movies to watch. Again, I think part of it was sort of colored by the cartoon show in the 90s. I just did not enjoy the Iron Man cartoon show in the 90s for whatever reason, and that made me not want to go see Iron Man the movie. But again, this was a big turnaround for Robert Downey Jr. He'd been having drug issues, but he had cleaned and sobered up by this point. But this is his really first blockbuster and really helped turn his career around. So good for him. Robert Downey Jr. and Tony Stark shared some similarities in terms of their lives, but they were basically both able to turn their lives around, and kudos to them. And so anyway, and there's Terrence Howard at the bottom. He got replaced by Don Cheadle as War Machine in later movies, because I guess when they were making this Iron Man movie, they weren't originally figuring out, like, who's going to be our star for Iron Man. Jon Favreau made this movie really had to push for Robert Downey Jr., but I believe Terrence Howard was the first person who was contracted to make this movie, and they gave him like a really big deal. And then when they made the second movie, they're like, well, is there any possibility you take less money? And he said no. And then he basically was fired, more or less. At least that's how the story goes. I don't know anything about this one way or the other, but that's what I heard. But anyway, but of course, some other movies that came out this time was The Incredible Hulk. This movie was not quite a sequel to the first Hulk movie with Eric Bana in it, but Edward Norton was in it. He played Bruce Banner. He was the Hulk. Edward Norton really felt strongly about this character. I think he was a big fan, I would think, of the original Bill Bixby series in the 80s. But anyway, he was a big fan of The Incredible Hulk. And this show in some ways mirrors the Bill Bixby show. But anyway, he was a big fan of the character, but he clashed with Marvel Studios over this. But really the big thing about that, though, is unlike the cinematic universes I mentioned earlier, like Frankenstein and Godzilla, those were all done by the same movie studio. Well, it was a big deal that Tony Stark, or Robert Downey Jr., played Tony Stark in a scene in The Incredible Hulk, because The Incredible Hulk was released by Universal Studios. That was a big deal that you had a character appearing in different film studios movies, which was kind of wild. I did see The Incredible Hulk in theaters. I also saw Thor in theaters as well. Thor was all right. I mean, it was at times too serious and at times not serious enough. I don't know how best to describe it. It was okay. Of course, we also started seeing post-credit scenes in these movies. That again was something Marvel sort of mainstream, made it more popular. Post-credit stuff had been done before. In fact, even the Godzilla series in the early 2000s was doing post-credit scenes. But regardless, they really did post-credit scenes where they were able to tease the next movie. And unfortunately, I do not recall what the post-credit scene was in Thor, if it had one, because the Incredible Hulk didn't have one. I know that much. Of course, we had Captain America, the first Avenger, of course, with Chris Evans as not as Johnny Storm, but as Captain America. Kudos to them for hiring him. I mean, I remember when this movie was coming out, the big joke was, oh, you hired Johnny Storm to be Captain America? Well, they did, and kudos to him. He pulled it off. Overseas, this movie was known as Captain America, the First Avenger. That was of course a big deal because overseas, because they want to associate Captain America with the Avengers. They figured overseas people may not know that Captain America is part of the Marvel pantheon, so overseas he was branded as Captain America the First Avenger. And I don't know if later on releases in the US kept that title or not, or they just left it as Captain America. But regardless, that's why it says Captain America the First Avenger. And of course, here's where a big change comes in how Marvel was planning to release these films. Well, enter the House of Mouse. Bob Iger, who was then the current CEO of Disney, and he's currently the CEO now, he sought to expand Disney's influence to additional demographics beyond the core Disney audience, because right now Disney was also not doing so hot. They of course, their successes in the 90s of their animated movies like Aladdin, Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, that was all behind them. They were now releasing like direct-to-video sequels. I mean, they did have some success with Pixar, of course, but they didn't own Pixar at the time. But basically, they realized in the 90s, although they later bought them, they realized that we really want to expand to a larger audience, particularly if we can the male audience. Those are male demographics. So on August 31st, 2009, Disney announced it would be purchasing Marvel Entertainment for $4 billion, and the deal was finalized on December 31st, 2009 of that year. I used to work at Best Buy in 2009, and I remember that that a bunch of my fellow coworkers and we went off to go do Relay for Life. And when we weren't running around the track, this was the big topic of conversation, was that Disney had bought Marvel. And what did that mean for the future of Marvel? Well, Disney largely was hands off, but as we can see, I mean, they made almost $30 billion from the movies alone, not accounting merchandising, comic book money, and all that. So this deal is very handsomely paid off. Now, Disney then, though, would be the distributor for all Marvel Studios properties going forward, starting with the Avengers, which was to have originally been distributed by Paramount. If you ever watched the first Avengers movie trailer, you can see that Paramount's logo was on that movie because they were supposed to release it, and then Disney was able to get the rights away from them for the Avengers. And because Marvel Studios was the one making the movies for the other characters who were leading up to the Avengers, they were still holding on to those rights. They hadn't sold them to Paramount like they had in all their other characters in the 90s. So basically, Disney said, we're going to be the distributor going forward. Now, because of this, that basically put an end to Marvel Studios working with these outside studios like Universal Pictures to make like standalone movies for rights that Universal still had. So what I mean is that goes back to the Hulk. Again, Marvel Studios can make a Hulk movie, but Universal Studios has the right to put it out if they want to. Well, of course, Universal Studios is going to say yes, but now that Disney owned Marvel and Disney and Universal are competitors, they really didn't want to play ball with Universal, is what it seems to me. So that's basically ended all the standalone Hulk movies. The Hulk can appear in other Marvel movies by the MCU, but he just can't appear in a Hulk movie. So that's why we haven't seen a Hulk movie in 15 years. Same thing with Namor. Namor recently showed up in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. But again, from everything I've heard, it's the same story as the Hulk. So if Marvel Studios ever wanted to make a standalone Namor movie, again, Universal Studios, from what I heard, still owns the first right of refusal for the distribution rights. So we may never see a Namor movie. Again, that's just what I've read. Again, I'm not a lawyer and I don't work for any of these companies, so I could be wrong, but that's what I think it is. Although there would be one upcoming exception to Marvel working with outside studios, and we're going to see that a little bit later on. Now, because Edward Norton felt so strongly about the Hulk, about how he wanted the Hulk to, appear on screen, the storyline, so on and so forth. Well, Marvel Studios and him were basically at loggerheads. And so basically Edward Norton agreed to step down as the Hulk. He did not appear in the Avengers movie. That was a big blow, I thought, in trying to make the cinematic universe, because again, Edward Norton was not in the Avengers movie. But regardless, they replaced him with Mark Ruffalo, and I think Mark Ruffalo did a good job. It's just I really wish Edward Norton had stuck around with the role. But anyway, here's the Avengers movie. Of course, Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, Mark Ruffalo, Chris Hemsworth, Scarlett Johansson, Jeremy Renner, Tom Hiddleston, and Samuel L. Jackson. They blew it out the park. They stuck the landing. I mean, they started off strong, and they got the Avengers movie. And this movie, I believe it made like over $1 billion at the box office, which again shows just the popularity of these characters and how they could make a movie with all these characters in their own movies and bring it together into one team up, which is not easy to do, because we've seen other we've seen other movie studios try and do the same thing, and they have not succeeded. So anyway, but anyway, so what were the movies that came out this phase? Well, we had Iron Man, which came out, again, the first movie came out on May 2nd, 2008. The Incredible Hulk came out on June 13th, 2008. Iron Man 2 came out on May 7th, 2010. Yes, I did see Iron Man 2 in theaters. I learned my lesson from not seeing the first Iron Man in theaters. Thor came out on May 6th, 2011. Captain America came out on July 22nd, 2011. And then finally, we had the Avengers on May 4th, 2012. I can't believe they stole Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you, but that's okay, because believe it or not, only a couple of years later, Disney would end up buying Lucasfilm and all of Star Wars too. So, I guess it was a sign of things to come, or else just a coincidence. I think it was a coincidence. It was definitely a coincidence. Anyway, so moving on to phase 2, which is the age of sequels, or Ultron. A little joke on my part. This is when the sequels really started to take off. This phase 2 lasted from 2013 to 2015, although I'm not going to mention many of the sequels in phase 2, although I will mention Iron Man 3. And of course, Captain America, the Winter Soldier. I mean, just editorialize, I did not enjoy Iron Man 3 all that much. In fact, I can't even recall if I even saw it in theaters. I was disappointed by the reveal of who the Mandarin was and wasn't. I thought the setup was better than the execution. But again, that's just my personal opinion. Although Captain America and the Winter Soldier was a very good movie, I thought, with Robert Redford in it. Although I don't recall if I saw that in theaters. I might have just seen it on DVD later on. But I thought it was a pretty good movie. Again, they got Robert Redford to show up, which I thought was kind of wild that they were getting these A-list actors to appear in these MCU movies or comic book movies. Of course, we had Guardians of the Galaxy, which is a movie I enjoyed. I liked that it was more out into outer space, and it was something different from where the MCU had been to this point. It was not Earthbound. In fact, really no Marvel characters in the MCU really showed up in this movie, aside from Thanos, who has been teased in the first Avengers movie. Although I think because Thanos was teased in the first Avengers movie, and he was going to be, and he was also in Guardians of the Galaxy, I think it was a little bit disappointed with Avengers Age of Ultron. They were building up to Thanos, and then Avengers Age of Ultron didn't really have Thanos at all until like the final scene of the movie in the post-credits sequence. And it just really felt a little bit of a letdown. I mean, it's an okay movie. I'm not saying it's bad. Just, they're building up to Thanos, and we didn't get him. But anyway, that's another story. But anyway, but yeah, so this is, again, the Avengers teamed up again, made a whole lot of money. Although the final movie of this phase was actually Ant-Man with Paul Rudd. I've not seen any of the Ant-Man movies either. I probably should, but I've yet to do so. Although one fun story with me, though, is I went to C2E2, which is Chicago Comic-Con, in right before the final, right before Avengers Endgame came out, I think it was. And Paul Rudd there was part of a Clueless reunion, and I was in there in the audience, just figured, hey, went out, I'll listen to what they have to say. And Paul Rudd came in a little bit late because he was signing autographs. And his first line was, when it came to the Avengers movie Endgame, I think, or else, anyway, he was like, I know everything. And I think when people were asking questions, everyone was asking questions to Paul Rudd about the Avengers and not so much about Clueless. But anyway, that was my fun little story. So yeah, but anyway, but that was fun. But anyway, yeah, the Ant-Man movies came out. Ant-Man was also originally supposed to have been directed by Edgar Wright, but but alas, he also had conflicts with Marvel Studios over his plans for how he envisioned Ant-Man. So he was ultimately replaced by Peyton Reed. But anyway, so that's Ant-Man. Now, while this is going on through this phase and slightly into the next, is at the time this was going on, ABC, because ABC is owned by Disney, just like Marvel was, they started making their own TV shows based on Marvel characters or Marvel properties. This was something that Marvel Studios was not involved in. So basically, it's like they're both part of the MCU, but they're not part of the MCU. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. did feature like some characters from the Marvel movies, but the Marvel movies have never referenced Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., so it's not really, in a sense, canon. Inhumans is sort of a similar story, although one of the characters did show up in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, but he was in the alternate universe rather than the mainstream one. So Inhumans has not really been referenced much either. And then, of course, although Agent Carter, though, did have some pretty heavy involvement from the Marvel Studios, so that one might be more canon to the MCU. But regardless, those are three shows that came out that, again, Marvel just didn't really have anything to do with outside of Agent Carter. And I'm not going to talk too much about the Netflix series, which came out later on, but because it's sort of outside the scope of this presentation. But anyway, yeah, just something to be aware of. I remember watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. on TV. So the movies, at least this phase, were Iron Man 3 came out on May 3rd, 2013. Thor: The Dark World came out on November 8th, 2013. Captain America: The Winter Soldier came out on April 4th, 2014. Guardians of the Galaxy came out on August 1st, 2014. Avengers: Age of Ultron came out on May 1st, 2015. And Ant-Man came out on July 17th, 2015. And for you Star Wars fans out there, Star Wars The Force Awakens came out in December of 2015. So then moving on from phase 2, we're moving into phase 3, which is sort of the end of an era. Everything that built up to this point was leading up to the final Avengers movie of the original trilogy, Avengers trilogy, or the final 2 movies in the Avengers trilogy. So it's the end of an era, 2016 to 2019. This is sort of the end of the original run. The end of the Avengers trilogy, even though it was 2 different movies, united all the MCU heroes up to that point. But going back to my point earlier about outside distributors, there was one unexpected newcomer this phase, and that was Spider-Man. So in 2014, so Sony Pictures was going to I don't know, this is not, none of this was proven, but basically Sony Pictures was going to had a huge email hack that happened, and a lot of emails that were in the company of their movie studio was released to the public. Some say this might have been in retaliation for a movie that Seth Rogen was making called The Dictator, which is about Kim Jong-il in North Korea. I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying that's not true. I don't think they ever figured out who hacked the emails. But regardless, because of the Sony Pictures email hack, word got out to the general public and the comic book fans that because Sony Pictures was not doing so good financially, and their last 2 Spider-Man movies with Andrew Garfield hadn't really done all that well. I mean, they'd done okay. That they were in talks with Marvel to allow Spider-Man into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but Sony would still distribute the movies. Well, by the time this email hack happened, those talks had fallen apart for one reason or the other. But when word got out about this, and fans were like, sending letters or sending emails or tweeting about it, you name it, Marvel and Sony went back to the drawing board, and they were able to hammer out an agreement for X amount of movies to reintroduce Spider-Man into the MCU. We thought there was a possibility it could have been Andrew Garfield reprising his role as the Amazing Spider-Man, but ultimately when they decided to recast, and because they wanted somebody younger, and that's how we got Tom Holland. But anyway, so that was a big change this phase, that they were able to quickly get the rights to Spider-Man. Although again, Sony would still be the ones releasing these movies. That's why you see the Sony Pictures logo at the beginning of the Spider-Man movies. And also because also they had something to say over the villains. So for example, Morbius, the Morbius movie, that's not part of the MCU. That's why it says in association with Marvel Studios. Kraven the Hunter, which is coming out soon, is the same story. Kraven is not part of the MCU. It's the same with Venom. Venom showed up very briefly in the MCU, spoilers, but then he went back to his own universe, which is the Sony universe. So again, we have all these Spider-Man villains that just simply are not part of the MCU. Only Spider-Man is. But that's just part of rights deals and negotiations and stuff. But ultimately, phase 3 culminates in Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, and the total worldwide box office this phase was $13.5 billion. That is a lot of money. Of course, we had Doctor Strange came out this phase. I didn't see Doctor Strange aside from some scenes here and there, although I did go see Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Spider-Man Homecoming, of course, I went to go see that. Everyone got all excited when they saw Spider-Man flying by with Tony Stark. But of course, Spider-Man was first introduced in Captain America Civil War. This was a really good movie. In fact, this easily could have been an Avengers movie, and they could have had a whole phase about them building up to Civil War, but they didn't. I think the reason why is Civil War was originally, there wasn't supposed to be as much of a Civil War. I heard that it wasn't until, like, originally Robert Downey Jr. was not supposed to have been in this movie as much as he was, but I think at the end he's like, you know what, I'll be in the movie a lot more than you originally thought I would be. And we got more of a Civil War out of it. It was a really good movie. I just kind of wish it was more drawn out. But anyway, of course, we had Brie Larson was in Captain Marvel. I went to go see this movie in theaters. I enjoyed it. And we learned more about Nick Fury and so on and so forth. Black Panther was a really good movie. Made a whole lot of money at the box office. And so that one came out. Of course, Black Panther was debuted in Civil War, but unfortunately, as we may know, Chadwick Boseman sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but he did a really good job as T'Challa. But anyway, yes, he passed away, unfortunately. But he left a big legacy behind with Black Panther. Of course, we had our two Avengers movies that came out this phase: Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Again, a couple of really good movies. I remember seeing these in packed houses of people, and so that was really there were a couple of really good movies that really capped off, ended Thanos' story and also just ended a story for some of our heroes as well. So the movies this phase, there were quite a few. Captain America Civil War came out on May 6, 2016. Doctor Strange came out on November 4th, 2016. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 came out on May 5th, 2017. Spider-Man Homecoming came out on July 7th, 2017. Thor Ragnarok came out on November 3rd, 2017. Again, they were ramping up to 3 movies a year, and they were all successful, which again proves that Marvel really knew what they were doing. Their brand name was enough to be able to release 3 different movies in a year and have all of them be successful. Black Panther came out February 16th, 2018. In general, like the early winter months, like February, are not traditionally known as a good time to release movies to make money. But again, because Marvel had that brand name, because they built up that trust with their audience and especially because it was Black Panther, they released it in February and they made a whole lot of money off of it. Where previously that wasn't always the case with movies that came out in February. Avengers Infinity War then came out in April 27th, 2018. Between the 2 Avengers movies, we had Ant-Man and the Wasp, which came out on July 6th, 2018. Captain Marvel came out on March 8th, 2019. Avengers Endgame, then the final Avengers movie, came out on April 26th, 2019. And Spider-Man Far From Home ended this phase. It came out on July 2nd, 2019. So there were 2 Spider-Man movies this phase as well. But again, and they really got them out the door, and they were successful. Now moving on from phase 3, though, we're moving now into phase 4, which is sort of a rebuilding of our characters, of our new heroes, rebuilding the roster, if you will. And it was also the start of the multiverse. Now, why did we skip a year? Avengers came out in 2019. Why were there no movies in 2020? We hadn't really seen that since phase 1. Well, that's because of COVID-19. COVID-19 threw a delay in almost all the movies that were set to be released in 2020. They either got pushed back or ultimately never came out on theaters. They came out on streaming. For the MCU, the movie releases were pushed back. Sorry, and some productions were delayed, and there ultimately were no 2020 films that came out for the MCU. Now, in a bit of a controversial move, Bob Iger had been replaced by a new Disney CEO called Bob Chapek. Bob Iger had retired. Bob Chapek decided that they're going to release some Disney movies, like Pixar movies as well. They're going to release them as both in theaters and in streaming at the same time. This was very controversial because I guess from what I read, there wasn't much, they didn't inform a lot of the movie studios or the people who were making these movies saying, we're going to release, your movies in theaters and streaming at the same time. And they were the only ones who did this. Warner Brothers notoriously did this as well, made a lot of people mad at their studio. But for the MCU goes, is Scarlett Johansson took offense that Black Widow which was supposed to come out in theaters, was also coming out on streaming because she was a producer on that movie and she was set to make money based off of how well the movie did at the box office. Well, because it wasn't released in theaters, exclusively in theaters, she felt she lost money, and so she sued Disney for the money she felt that she lost, or the money she felt she was owed. In response, Bev Chapek says some not too flattering remarks about Scarlett Johansson, but then they were able to come to terms and they settled privately. So presumably Scarlett Johansson got her money. Of course, because of COVID and everything else that was going on, there were fewer releases this phase. Profitability was down due to fewer films. So of course the total wide box office, and because also some of these movies are also released streaming, if not the same day, then shortly thereafter, the total worldwide box office went down from 13 billion from the last phase to 5.712 billion this phase, but that's not too bad. I mean, that's still a really good amount of money. I mean, I think it was like phase 2, I think it made $5 billion. So, but again, it was just a tough time to releasing movies. Now, though, to make up for this, though, Marvel finally started, because now Marvel Studios finally had control over the sort of the TV rights, if you will, of these characters from Marvel Television. They were also able to start releasing streaming shows, and they were finally able to get around to the point where we're going to release streaming shows for the first time under the direct control again of Feige and Marvel Studios. That's meant these streaming shows are now part of the MCU, and there is quite a few of them. We had WandaVision, Falcon and Winter Soldier. We had Loki, Hawkeye, Ms. Marvel, and She-Hulk came out during this phase. But in addition to stuff beginning, some stuff was also ending. The Spider-Man deal by this phase had basically ended with Sony. Spider-Man was contracted for X amount of films in the MCU, and then that deal ran out. And Marvel and Sony could not come to an agreement on a new deal, and it looked like the deal was going to fall apart. Whatever the third Spider-Man movie was going to be, it was not going to be part of the MCU. And Tom Holland, like he really, like, he was devastated that I think his fear is that the third movie in the Spider-Man movies was not going to be, in his Spider-Man trilogy, was not going to be as good as the first two because Marvel wasn't involved. Of course, we saw in this Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, the third Spider-Man movie was not really as well regarded as the first two. In fact, Andrew Garfield his Amazing Spider-Man didn't even get a third movie because it didn't do so well at the box office, and it was critically panned. And Tom Holland understandably did not want to be in the same situation. He still wanted to be part of the MCU, so he went to Disney, he went to Bob Iger, basically said, I'm desperate, please do whatever you can to make this deal go through. And kudos to Marvel and Sony, they were able to work out another deal. How many movies this is or what the terms are, I don't know. I mean, the original deal, we knew how many movies it was, but we don't know what it is for this one. So again, the plug could be pulled again at any time, but they were able to make a third Spider-Man movie in the MCU. Now, the other big thing is, and this happened in the prior phase, was, so we know that Marvel didn't have any rights for Spider-Man, but the other two major properties that didn't have the rights to were the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. The movie rights to those characters are owned by 20th Century Fox, and basically with Fox, as long as they kept making X-Men movies or they kept making Fantastic Four movies, and however many years between movies, they were able to hold on to those rights again in perpetuity. They basically forever. There was really nothing Marvel could do to get back the rights to those franchises, and these are major properties. I mean, the Fantastic Four have, Doctor Doom and Galactus and a whole bunch of other characters that just simply Marvel could not use, as well as the X-Men. I mean, the X-Men, there's like thousands of X-Men characters and thousands of villains. They just couldn't use these properties. But although the ones that they were able to share, though, and this had to deal with a lot of dealings as well behind the scenes, was Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver are mostly associated, in the comics at least, more associated with the Avengers than they are with the X-Men, even though both of them are mutants and Magneto is their father. Well, basically they had to work it out with Sony, with Fox and Marvel were able to work it out where they were able to both use the characters. But I think because of this is why Quicksilver died off in Age of Ultron, And in the X-Men series, they never really referenced Scarlet Witch all that much. They only referenced Quicksilver. So basically, Scarlet Witch was with the MCU, and Quicksilver was part of the X-Men. Now, what changed though is in 2017, due to profitability concerns with 20th Century Fox, their entertainment property, and also because Fox was not really able to secure a streaming future like Disney and Netflix and all these other studios, they decided they were going to sell off their entertainment studio division. Of course, between the movies, the fact that for Marvel, at least, the 20th Century Fox had the movie rights to these characters, and also it was also lucrative for Lucasfilm as well, because Lucasfilm, they had since been bought out by Disney. Lucasfilm had the distribution rights for every Star Wars movie except for the first Star Wars movie, or as is later labeled A New Hope. If they were to put Star Wars on Disney Plus, they could not include A New Hope as part of the movie package because 20th Century Fox owned the permanent distribution rights for it. So 20th Century Fox is a very, very, and plus all the other movies that Fox had made over the years was very appealing to Disney because they could put those movies on Disney Plus, or they could also acquire Hulu through the transaction and put the movies on there as well. This is really a big get for them. So they really went all in on it. So Disney bought 20th Century Fox. Now, they later renamed it 20th Century Studios. Part of that is because of confusion over the Fox name. Rupert Murdoch and company, they still own what's called Fox Core. That includes Fox the network, because Disney did not buy Fox the network. They also didn't buy Fox News either. There was a lot of confusion. Does that mean Disney owns Fox News now? Well, the answer is no. That is still owned by Rupert Murdoch and Fox Corp. But basically, because of that confusion, and they didn't want people to be confused, they renamed the studio to 20th Century Studios, which was at one point its name like almost 100 years ago. So the deal completed on March 20th, 2019 for $71.3 billion. That's a lot of money. In fact, Comcast made a play for them as well. I think Disney originally only bid 64, but they had to bump it up so Comcast didn't get a hold of them. But basically what that means is that the Fantastic Four and the X-Men movie rights were returned to Marvel Studios. However, unlike with Spider-Man, who they were quickly made a movie about, it seemingly, and integrated him into the MCU, with Spider-Man, though, he was just a single character. Feige, though, in Marvel Studios, they had already planned out the next several years of the MCU. So basically they said, well, we can't really integrate Fantastic Four right away. We can't integrate the X-Men right away. We can't just shoehorn them in. We had our plan. We're going to stick to it. We're not going to rush to have these characters. However, though, references start cropping up this phase, not so much to the Fantastic Four, but we do start seeing references to mutants. So again, some of the movies that came out this phase and TV shows, of course, we have Black Widow, Scarlett Johansson's swan song as Natasha Romanoff. Black Widow, like Feige had been pushing for a while to make a Black Widow movie, and allegedly, again I say allegedly, Ike Perlmutter, who had gotten Marvel out of bankruptcy, and was basically had permanent rights to run Marvel. He was not a big fan of releasing a female-led superhero movie. Again, I say allegedly. And so basically Feige and Marvel Studios then parted ways with Marvel Entertainment and became their own division in Disney, and they were able to make a Black Widow movie finally. But anyway, that's why it took so long to make a Black Widow movie. Why? Because it came out after her character had died in Avengers Endgame, but this was, of course, was a prequel, but that's why it took so long for this movie to come out, allegedly. Of course, we had Marvel Studios. There was their first foray into studios was WandaVision. They really did a good job with it, I thought. Basically, Wanda is depressed because Vision, who she was romantically linked to up there at the top, he had died as well in the Avengers, in the final two Avengers movies. So basically, she took over this town. She turned it into a sitcom. She sort of resurrected Vision, and then there's this whole thing about well, what's really going on here. In addition to that, though, we also had Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. I saw this in theaters. I really enjoyed it. If you're looking for a Marvel movie to watch, like they came out more recently that wasn't really as connected with the other Marvel movies, I really recommend Shang-Chi. They did more with the Mandarin. I kind of wish someone who shall not be named for spoiler reasons was the Mandarin. But again, they did what they could. I just really want to see. I don't know what I'm looking for in the Mandarin, but I still have yet to see it. Anyway, and they also released the Eternals. I didn't see this movie in theaters. It didn't do so well commercially, but hey, they got Angelina Jolie in it and Selma Hayek, so clearly they're doing something right to be getting these big names in these Marvel movies. Of course, we have Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. I didn't have the opportunity to see this in theaters. I do need to watch it though. Angela Bassett, by all intents and purposes, put out of course she put out an Oscar-nominated performance, so that was really good for her. Again, it's kind of sad because again, Chadwick Boseman had passed away. I believe Black Panther was originally supposed to be a major character. He's supposed to be, I believe, the Tony Stark of this phase, but it just didn't come to fruition. And we have Spider-Man: No Way Home. This was a really good movie, really proved the multiverse. Although because of COVID, Spider-Man: No Way Home was supposed to come out after Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, but because of everything that was going on, it ended up coming out before Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and so they had to alter some dialogue in the movie, I think, to reflect that. But we got our Spider-Man cinematic universe, if you will, and I won't spoil anything more, but kudos to them for being able to pull it off and really honor the history of Spider-Man, which I'm sure meant a lot to Kevin Feige because he had produced the first three Spider-Man movies with Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire, and he had also produced the next two movies with Andrew Garfield, even while he was still, well, as the Marvel Cinematic Universe was set to take off. Of course, we had some teases to the multiverse, but also to mutants. If you don't know this, there's a scene in WandaVision where Wanda goes to answer the door, and behind it is Quicksilver, her brother, who had died off in the Avengers movies. But basically, Quicksilver is now played by Evan Peters. Evan Peters played Quicksilver in the X-Men movies, which were not part of the MCU, and everybody went crazy thinking, oh, this is it. This is the multiverse. The X-Men from the Fox X-Men are coming to the MCU. Now, how that played out, I'm not going to spoil anything. You'll have to watch out how WandaVision ended, but that was a big tease, not just for mutants, but for the X-Men and especially the Fox X-Men. Another thing, of course, that middle link there is just to the trailer for Spider-Man: No Way Home. I fully expected spoilers because of the Sony deal basically almost coming to an end at this point. I fully expected the Spider-Man: No Way Home, because it involves the multiverse and universe realities coming together. I expected the way it ended was going to be that Spider-Man was going to be kicked out of the MCU and into his own movie universe, the Sony cinematic universe, but surprisingly, it didn't come to be. Spider-Man is still part of the MCU, and they're planning to eventually make a fourth Spider-Man movie, and not including Spider-Man as any other movie. So I'll be curious to see how that goes and how long that deal lasts between Sony and Marvel. And the final clip there is from the Ms. Marvel show. Spoilers, Ms. Marvel, of course, has powers. And the question is, well, why does she have powers, but why does her family not have the same powers? Why are they not able to take advantage of what she uses to get her powers? Well, what her friend discovers is he's like, I looked at your genes and it turns out there's something more going on. There's some sort of mutation. And as soon as he says that, it's kind of hard to hear in the background, but you hear a little guitar riff, and that guitar riff is for the X-Men the Animated Series cartoon show. That was its opening theme. Unlike Professor X, who had showed up as Patrick Stewart in Doctor Strange and Multiverse of Madness, this was the first solid reference in the MCU about mutants, and they also use the X-Men animated series guitar riff. So basically, in a sense, Ms. Marvel is the first confirmed mutant in the MCU, and that's a big deal. Again, I'm a huge X-Men fan. I'm really excited to see where things go, because that brings us. But before we get ahead of ourselves, what were the movies this phase? Well, we had Black Widow, we had Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Black Widow came out on July 9th, 2021. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings came out on September 3rd, 2021. The Eternals came out on November 5th, 2021. And Spider-Man: No Way Home came out on December 17th, 2021. They actually had 4 Marvel movies come out in the same year, although again, part of that was because a lot of these movies, at least Black Widow, I think, probably got pushed back from 2020, but they were able to pull out 4 movies, and they were all reasonable successes given that COVID was still going on in 2021. And then starting in 2022, we had Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness in May 6, 2022. That movie was directed by Sam Raimi, who had directed the first 3 Spider-Man movies. What's fun is that in Spider-Man 2, there was also a brief reference to Doctor Strange, because I believe Sam Raimi is a big fan of Doctor Strange. So it was kind of nice to see him finally make a Doctor Strange movie all these years later. But anyway, of course, we had Thor: Love and Thunder came out on July 8th, 2020. July 8th, 2022. That movie was I think one of the more successful Thor movies in theaters. And then we had Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, came out on November 11th, 2022. And that brings us to phase 5, which is where we are now, because again, I'm recording this in June of 2023. This phase will last from 2023 to 2025. So building up, they're basically building up to the next Avengers this phase. So we've had Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which is February 17th, 2023. That came out earlier this year. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 came out last month on May 5th, 2023. The Marvels is set to come out on November 10th, 2023. Now, because Marvel now owns the Fox X-Men, Ryan Reynolds was able to convince them to make another Deadpool movie, Deadpool 3. This will be important for a couple of reasons. One is Hugh Jackman is returning as Wolverine, so we're finally going to get that Wolverine Deadpool movie that's been teased forever. The other thing, though, is this part of the MCU? Don't know. Deadpool is very much he breaks the fourth wall, so he's always cracking jokes about other franchises and other and other movies. There's a possibility that these characters may somehow be integrated into the MCU. On the other hand, maybe they won't. We'll have to find out. But the other thing, though, is this is going to be the first Marvel Studios made movie in the Marvel movie, whether it's part of the MCU or not, that is rated R. Or is planned to be rated R. That's gonna be a big deal for them, because that was a big point of contention when Disney bought Fox. Fox was making rated R superhero movies. Is Marvel going to do the same? And that was a big point of debate, because Disney in general doesn't make rated R movies. But anyway, aside from some of their smaller studios that they owned. But anyway, that's the big thing. Is this going to be rated R? Is it going to be part of the MCU? I guess we'll find out on May 3rd, 2024. Captain America: Brave New World is going to be coming out on July 26, 2024. I think there was originally, this show might have been originally been planned to be streaming movie, but regardless, it's going to be in theaters. Anthony Mackie is going to be the new Captain America. I'm looking forward to that movie. I'm excited. I'm interested to see it in theaters. Thunderbolts is going to be coming out on December 20th, 24. That's going to feature Yelena of course, from Black Widow's younger sister. So that's going to be interesting. It's a bunch of anti-heroes who are hired by the government to do something or other. They're finally going to be making a new Blade movie with Mahershala Ali on February 14th, 2025, although that movie keeps getting pushed back. They've been having some behind-the-scenes issues. I hope the movie is a success. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a big Wesley Snipes fan. I was kind of bummed that he's not gonna be playing Blade in the MCU, although I understand why. But Mahershala Ali came to Marvel and said, "I want to be Blade," and they're like, "Well, you're Oscar nominated, and we would be crazy not to do this." So they're gonna make a Blade movie. I don't know if they're gonna make a non-rated R Blade movie, if it is PG-13, but they'll try. I mean, the first 3 Blade movies were all rated R, so I guess we'll find out. Now, as far as Disney Plus goes, this is very much abridged of what's coming out from them, but as far as the MCU, but of course, Secret Invasion is going on right now with the Skrulls, June to July 2023. X-Men 97 is not part of the MCU, but again, I'm a big X-Men fan, so of course I have to mention it. X-Men 97 is going to be an animated continuation of the X-Men the Animated Series show. It's called X-Men 97 because the original run of the show ended in 97. So this is going to be picking up after that. Really excited. They got a lot of the voice actors from the original X-Men show to come back. So and some of the writers too, and producers. So I'm really excited to see where that goes. Ironheart is it's an Iron Man related show, as going to come out in 2024. Daredevil Born Again is coming out in 2024. That's a big deal because again, the character who played Daredevil in the Netflix series and also briefly showed up in Spider-Man No Way Home, who's the actor's name I cannot remember, but anyway, he showed up as Daredevil from the Netflix series. Well, he showed up in Spider-Man No Way Home, and now he's going to be in his own show on Disney Plus. Now the question though is and I think the answer is going to be no, is the character that this is not going to be the same Daredevil that was in the Netflix series, although it does feature I keep saying his name. I keep on saying Charlie Haas, but that's not right, I don't think. But anyway, he's going to be in as Daredevil. Vincent D'Onofrio is going to return as Kingpin. But it's really a big deal because, again, this is probably not going to be a continuation of the Netflix series. It's just going to be featuring 2 of the main characters in a new Disney Plus series, hence the Born Again part of the tagline of the show. But again, we'll find out. Oh, also, I believe it's also in She-Hulk as well. I didn't watch She-Hulk because I don't have Disney Plus. But anyway. Moving on, we're moving on to phase 6. That is where things are going to be. So things to come, 2025 to 2027. So this is going to be a Fantastic phase. So they finally announced when they're going to be making their Fantastic Four movie. Again, some of these release dates have been pushed back just recently, but Fantastic Four is currently slated to come out on May 2nd, 2025. Avengers: The Kang Dynasty is going to be coming out on May 1st, 2026. And Avengers: Secret Wars is going to be coming out on May 7th, 2027. And these release dates were recently pushed back. And unfortunately, Jonathan Majors has run into some alleged domestic issues. He plays Kang. We'll see how that works itself out. But anyway, so yeah, these are slated to come out. There's still more movies that have yet to be revealed. I believe they're called Untitled MCU movies. We'll see how that goes. We're not going to really learn. I don't think we're going to learn much of anything this year because Marvel just recently announced that they were skipping Comic-Con this year, San Diego Comic-Con, because they must not have really anything they're ready to announce or show any trailers for. So again, I guess we'll find out more next year or maybe the year after. Now, again, a big X-Men fan. The X-Men are coming to the MCU. Hopefully someday. Will it be the Fox X-Men? I don't know. I want to say no, but I think there's still a glimmer of hope, especially with Secret Wars, because Secret Wars, if you don't know, in the comics was a combination of every superhero you can imagine, fighting every villain you can imagine. That people think the Fox X-Men are going to show up in Secret Wars. They also think Tobey Maguire might show up as Spider-Man, but I don't know where they're getting that idea from. But anyway. But again, the rumors are they may possibly still be able to integrate the Fox X-Men, especially all this multiverse stuff going on, into the MCU proper. I wouldn't like to see that. On the other hand, I fully understand if they realize we can't carry the baggage of the X-Men series because it had its highs and it had its lows, and we're just gonna have to move on from those and create a whole new, hire completely new people to play these characters. We'll find out. I'd say they're probably going to make an Adam Warlock movie. He showed up in Guardians of the Galaxy 3 just recently. I think it's probable. Are we going to get a Shuri movie from Black Panther? I think it's a possibility, if not an MCU TV show, maybe on Disney Plus. I thought she was always supposed to have her Disney Plus show, but I don't know anything came of it. I might have misread that. Yeah, because of the distribution rights, though, we're probably never going to get a standalone Namor movie because, again, Universal supposedly still has the rights to release those movies, but we might. Well, I'm sure we'll see him crop up more in other movies. And yes, and maybe one day we'll hear the X-Men the Animated Series logo in front of the MCU, in front of the Marvel Studios logo, or maybe we'll hear the Fox X-Men fanfare in front of the the Marvel Studios logo. I guess we'll just have to find out, or maybe there'll be a completely new theme. But of course, my dream is, and my impossible dream is, if you didn't know this, is to have the Avengers and the Fantastic Four and S.H.I.E.L.D. fight Godzilla. Of course, Godzilla's movie rights, in America at least, are owned by Warner Brothers. But if Warner Brothers ever gave it up, and Disney for some reason wanted to get the rights to Godzilla, if you didn't know, in the late 70s, from 77 to 79, Marvel got the comic book rights to Godzilla, and the final 2 issues, Godzilla invaded New York, and the Avengers and the Fantastic Four and S.H.I.E.L.D., as we can see on here, there's a helicarrier in the top left. They fought Godzilla, and they lost. Godzilla defeated all of them. But then it ended where a little boy who was part of the comic book series went up on the roof and said, "Godzilla, don't be bad, be nice, go back into the ocean." Then Godzilla went to the ocean. That was the end of it. But anyway, I'm a big Godzilla fan first and foremost. So anyway, maybe one day this will happen, or maybe it won't. I can only dream. As the fever reaches critical, as the fever reaches critical peak, as Earth's mightiest heroes launch a last-ditch onslaught against the king of all monsters. And that was exciting. And with that, we say to be continued. I appreciate everyone coming out here today and listening to this. So yeah, I'm excited where things go. I'm sure you are too. And again, I'm not doing any of this. It's all part of Kevin Feige and Marvel Studios, and we'll just have to see where things go. But sky's the limit. And again, thank you for coming out, and thank you so much. So with that, I will end the recording, and I hope you have a good day. Bye.